What would you do if the person you trusted the most, the person you raised with your own hands, one day sold your deepest secrets to your enemy? That's exactly what happened to me. I was a retired Army officer. 30 years of my life, I served my country with loyalty, sacrifice, and pride. My son, Arav, grew up watching me wear that uniform, hearing my war stories, and learning about the values of honor and discipline. I thought he admired me. I thought he wanted to follow in my footsteps. But life has a cruel way of showing us the truth. One evening, I got a call from an old colleague in intelligence. His voice was heavy. He didn't waste time on greetings. He said, "Colonel, we've intercepted classified documents, and they were leaked from your home network." At first, I thought it was a mistake. My home? Impossible. But then he continued. The IP address is clear. The access came from Arav's personal device. I felt the ground beneath me vanish. My son? My blood? Selling army secrets? I wanted to scream, to deny, to accuse them of lying, but when I confronted Arav, his silence was louder than a confession. He didn't even try to deny it. His eyes looked away, his hands shook. That was the moment. I knew. My world collapsed in 1 second. Imagine this. A father who fought enemies on the battlefield, suddenly realizing his worst enemy is sitting across the dinner table. But the story doesn't end there. No, that was just the beginning. Because betrayal is a fire. Once it starts, it burns everything. And what Arav had done was far darker than just leaking documents. The moment I realized my own son was betraying me, a cold, hollow rage settled in my chest. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every memory of Arav as a child, the laughter, the hugs, the promises, felt like a lie crafted to lull me into trust. I needed answers. I needed to understand why the boy I had raised with so much love, discipline, and care could turn so cold, so calculating. It started with a simple question. Who is he working with? I followed him for a week, not in a paranoid way, but in the meticulous style of someone trained to notice every detail, every call, every meeting, every email. And that's when I found it. Arav was not just careless, he was bold. Bold enough to think he could manipulate his father, the man who had once been in charge of classified operations, right under my nose. He had been secretly meeting a group of businessmen, men I knew from old army contracts, people I'd trusted for decades. They were offering him a deal. My beachfront property, the same house I'd saved for his future, in exchange for certain files from my personal computer. The audacity of it made my blood boil. My own son was willing to gamble my legacy for instant gratification. But here's the thing. Arav didn't even have a plan to keep the money. His vision was short-sighted enough that it made me realize how truly foolish he had become. This wasn't about survival. This was about greed. Pure, unfiltered greed. The more I learned, the more it became clear he had convinced himself that love and loyalty were things that could be bought, that my years of hard work, the sacrifices I had made, working nights, giving up vacations, turning down promotions to care for family, were all just stepping stones for him to claim as his own. It wasn't just betrayal. It was contempt. I remember sitting in my study that night, staring at the framed photographs on my wall. Pictures of Arav as a toddler, his first steps, the first day of school, the first Little League game. And there he was now, planning to sell my house behind my back, expecting me to condone it, to hand over everything I'd built, everything I had earned, as if it were a gift to his ambition. I had to act. And I had to act fast. I started by reviewing every legal document tied to the property.
Mortgage papers, insurance policies, investment statements, ownership records. Everything was in my name. My house wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. The more I looked, the more I realized how much control I still had. Arav had assumed that my age, my health, and my trust would make it easy to coerce me. But he had underestimated one thing. I knew the rules of the game. The next morning, I put on my best calm, measured face and called my lawyer. Not the one Arav had been quietly contacting, but my long-time trusted legal advisor. "Good morning, Hiram," she said warmly, unaware of the storm brewing behind my voice. "Morning," I replied, steady and cold. "I need to set up a meeting, immediately. It's about my property, my estate, and a certain son who seems to think he has more rights than he actually does." There was a pause. Then, "I'll clear my schedule. Tell me everything when you get here." I drove to her office with the fury of a man who had been underestimated for too long. I wasn't going to scream, shout, or throw things. I was going to be precise. I was going to be unstoppable. As I sat across from her, I laid out everything I knew. The meetings, the emails, the documents, the secret attempts to sell my property behind my back. My lawyer's eyes narrowed in understanding. "He thought he could manipulate you," she said softly. "But the law is clear. Property doesn't transfer until the owner signs over their rights. And you still control everything." That's when the idea crystallized in my mind. Arav had gambled on my weakness, my supposed blind love. He had assumed that family bonds would make me compliant. He had assumed wrong. We began planning. Not a revenge in the petty sense, but a surgical strike, a methodical, legal, inescapable way to ensure that he understood the consequences of his greed without destroying his life entirely. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about teaching a lesson he would never forget. And so the game began. I made calls, arranged meetings, and started orchestrating a sequence of events that would put me firmly in control, while subtly letting Arav believe he still had a chance. I wanted him to learn what true consequence felt like. Meanwhile, I had to maintain the facade of normalcy. To Arav, I would appear calm, almost unaware, giving him the illusion that his plan might succeed. But beneath that calm, I was calculating every move, every response, every misstep he could possibly make. The first part of my plan was deceptively simple. I would make him believe that the property and my consent were already slipping from his grasp. And then, just when he thought he had outmaneuvered me, I would strike. It was time for the first act, a confrontation, carefully staged to make Arav reveal how far he was willing to go for greed. And it had to be public enough for him to realize that betrayal has consequences, not just for me, but for himself. I leaned back in my chair that evening, sipping my coffee, feeling an unfamiliar sense of clarity. For the first time since I'd discovered his betrayal, I felt in control. I wasn't a victim, I wasn't powerless. I was a father who had been wronged, and I would set the terms of justice. Tomorrow, the first piece of the plan would fall into place, and Arav would never see it coming.
The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Gone was the uncertainty, the betrayal-fueled anxiety that had haunted me since discovering Arav's secret meetings. Today, the plan would start, and every step had to be precise. No rash moves, no wasted words, just calculated action. I began with the neighbors, not out of malice, but to ensure that when the first domino fell, it would fall convincingly. I reached out to a few trusted faces on the block, people who had known my family for decades. Casual phone calls, small conversations about the weather, and subtle mentions that I was considering some changes with the property. Nothing concrete, but enough to plant a seed of curiosity and, more importantly, to make Arav believe he had the element of surprise. Next, I contacted a professional photographer and staging expert, not for a quick sale, but to create a sense of urgency. I wanted the property to shine, to look irresistible, not just to any buyer, but to the right buyer who would make Arav's assumptions crumble. If he thought this was going to be a slow process, he would be gravely mistaken. By noon, the first part of the trap was set. I called Arav, letting the phone ring longer than usual before answering. "Dad?" His voice had that practiced mix of caution and charm, like a predator testing the waters. "Hello, son," I said smoothly. "Just touching base about the beach house." There was a pause. I could almost hear him calculating, guessing how much I knew. "Yes, Dad, about that. I wanted to... Actually, I've decided to move forward sooner than expected. The house will be listed this week. It's already being prepared for viewings." Arav's silence was immediate and telling. I didn't need to push. I had already triggered the first crack in his carefully constructed world. "What? What do you mean, listed?" he finally demanded, his voice rising. "I mean exactly what I said. Professional photos, open houses, full market listing. The house isn't going anywhere except to someone who will appreciate it." He sputtered, trying to regain composure. "Dad, we were going to discuss this." "You assumed incorrectly," I said, letting the finality sink in. "Discussion is no longer on the table." I could almost hear the gears in his mind spinning, trying to recalculate, trying to find a loophole, but the first lesson was already sinking in. His plans relied entirely on my compliance, and I was not compliant. The day unfolded like clockwork. Calls with real estate agents, the staging, the photography session, it was all happening faster than he could anticipate. And as I orchestrated each step, I felt a strange exhilaration. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my power, my agency, and teaching my son the cost of entitlement. By evening, the first prospective buyer had seen the house. A young couple, enthusiastic and earnest, completely unaware that the property had become a battlefield for family pride. Watching them walk through the rooms, imagining their future there, I felt a surge of satisfaction. This home would now belong to someone who truly valued it, not someone who saw it as an inheritance to be claimed without gratitude. Later that night, Arav called again, desperate, testing every tone, every emotional lever he could pull. "Dad, please, just give me a chance. We can work something out. I thought you'd understand." I listened silently for a moment, then said calmly, "I understood plenty. I understood that you were willing to betray your father for a quick gain. I understood that my years of sacrifice meant nothing to you. That understanding is enough." The line went dead. I didn't need to say more. The first move had been made, and the game was now in motion. As I sat back, I realized something profound. For the first time in decades, I wasn't living in someone else's story. I was writing my own. And every choice from this moment forward would be mine, free from manipulation, free from guilt, and most importantly, free from betrayal. Tomorrow, the next phase begins, and Arav will finally learn that a father's love may be boundless, but a father's justice has limits.
The morning light streamed through the curtains, but it didn't warm me. It illuminated my purpose. Today, Arav would realize that the life he had planned on inheriting was no longer under his control. The house wasn't just a property. It was the symbol of years of sacrifice, love, and trust. Trust he had trampled without a second thought. I dressed deliberately, choosing clothes that projected calm authority rather than anger. This wasn't about yelling or confrontation. It was about proving a point. Every interaction would be a lesson, every word calculated. I wanted Arv to feel the full weight of the consequences of his actions. By 10 a.m., I was on the road, driving to the house. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a quiet determination. As I approached, I saw him, Arv, pacing the lawn like a predator uncertain of its territory, phone pressed to his ear, probably trying to call his mother or Jasper to demand reinforcements. The sight of his confidence wavering gave me a small, grim satisfaction. I parked across the street and walked slowly toward him, letting each step amplify the tension. When he saw me, his expression shifted from impatience to panic in seconds. "Dad, you can't do this! You can't!" he shouted before I even reached the sidewalk. "I already did," I said calmly, stopping a few feet away. My voice carried authority, but no anger, just truth. "The house has been sold. The keys are with the new owners. Your plans evaporated." He froze for a moment, as if trying to process the impossible. "I don't understand. You can't just take it away." I leaned slightly closer, my tone steady, unwavering. I did. You forgot one important thing. Inheritance doesn't come from assumptions. It comes from laws. And until I decide otherwise, this house is mine to give, to sell, to manage, not yours to demand. Arv's face contorted in frustration, disbelief, and fear. You're punishing me. I thought—" His voice broke. I could see the reality hitting him in pieces, each word I spoke dismantling the future he had meticulously planned. "I'm not punishing you, son. I'm showing you what happens when greed overrides respect, when entitlement blinds love. You gambled on my weakness, and you lost." He stumbled backward, gesturing wildly toward the front door. But the house, that's my inheritance, that's mine. You promised—" "I never promised you anything beyond love, guidance, and support. Everything else, luxury, privilege, property, was always a gift, conditional on respect and gratitude. You forfeited that the moment you tried to manipulate your father while he was in the hospital." Silence fell. A rare, heavy silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and forces introspection. Arv's mind raced, searching for excuses, for arguments, for the loopholes he thought existed. But there were none, not today. I can't believe you," he muttered finally, his voice barely audible. You're heartless." I shook my head slowly, sadness flickering in my eyes. "No, son, I'm not heartless. I'm finally honest. Honest about what I will tolerate, honest about the value of trust, and honest about the consequences of betrayal. You wanted me to be weak. You wanted me to comply. I chose to be strong instead." For the first time, I saw him falter completely. The arrogance, the entitlement, the assumptions, all stripped away. All that remained was a man confronted with his own failures. I turned toward my car without another word. I didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered. The confrontation was over. The real victory wasn't in the words I said. It was in the reality he now had no choice but to face. As I drove away, I realized the power of a simple truth. Respect and trust cannot be demanded. They must be earned. And sometimes the most powerful way to teach that truth is to remove what the unworthy assume is theirs.
Arv didn't give up. I knew that. Some people, when confronted with their mistakes, retreat, but he wasn't one of them. Greed had a way of clouding judgment, and in his case, it made him reckless. I had expected some confrontation at the house, maybe a dramatic plea, perhaps even threats. What I hadn't anticipated was the audacity of his next move. 2 days after the confrontation on the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a series of texts. At first glance, it seemed like his usual frantic attempts. "Dad, let's talk. I'll make it worth your while. I just need a few minutes. Please, don't ignore me." Each message was dripping with urgency, guilt, and desperation, carefully crafted to manipulate my emotions. But I didn't respond. Not a single word. By Friday, I learned through mutual neighbors that Arav had attempted to show up at my apartment uninvited. I had anticipated that. I had prepared. What I hadn't anticipated was the security guard's report. Arav had gotten into an argument with the hotel concierge, claiming he was entitled to my whereabouts, threatening legal action if anyone prevented him from finding me. I chuckled. Finally, he had realized that his assumptions about control had limits, that even the most entitled son couldn't bulldoze through a man who had finally drawn his line in the sand. Later that afternoon, I decided it was time to escalate, but on my own terms. I picked up my phone and called an old friend of mine, someone who had always been sharp with investments and legal strategy. "Raj, I need a favor. No, not just a favor, a masterpiece of timing and strategy. Can you help me turn the tables completely?" By evening, a plan had taken shape. I wasn't just going to defend my property. I was going to teach Arav a lesson in patience, consequence, and humility. The house sale had been a first wave. Now I needed to show that his manipulations could no longer dictate my life. The following morning, a certified letter arrived at Arav's home. He tore it open, eyes scanning the document. His face shifted through disbelief, panic, and rage as he realized the contents. A formal revocation of any claims to future gifts or inheritances, notarized, legally binding, and delivered with full disclosure of my intentions. Not just the beach house, but any asset I had. Everything he had counted on was now sealed by law, completely beyond his control. I watched from a distance as he fumed, pacing the lawn like a caged animal. His phone calls went unanswered, each one met with polite deflection or silence. The neighbors, previously unwitting witnesses, began murmuring among themselves, curious and slightly fearful of the tension that had built over weeks. I knew one thing clearly. The greatest revenge wasn't humiliation, it wasn't anger or confrontation. It was control. It was proving that the world didn't revolve around him, that his manipulations were powerless when faced with someone who had learned the rules of the game and played them perfectly. That evening I sat on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the ocean glinting faintly in the distance. Freedom tasted sweet. I had secured my peace, protected my hard-earned life, and ensured that Arav would never again gamble on my kindness. And yet, I felt a twinge of sadness. It wasn't about losing a son, it was about the loss of what could have been, a relationship built on trust and respect instead of greed and manipulation. But life, I realized, often gives you second chances only after teaching you the hardest lessons. Tomorrow, I thought, I will begin planning the next chapter of my life. A chapter without manipulation, without betrayal, but filled with choice, freedom, and the quiet satisfaction of a lesson finally learned. Arav's era of entitlement had ended, and in its place, something far more valuable had begun. Clarity, independence, and peace that no one could take away. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of my study, casting a warm glow over the papers that had once felt like chains around my life.
For months, I had been meticulously untangling the web of deception my son and his new wife had spun, each document and conversation bringing me closer to a truth that I had suspected but feared to confront. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma grounding me as I sat down with the stack of finalized legal documents in front of me. This was the culmination of everything: the planning, the patience, and the quiet fury that had fueled me for months. My son had tried to manipulate, intimidate, and guilt me, but he had underestimated one thing: my resolve. As I reviewed the paperwork one final time, I felt no remorse, no hesitation. I had taken every precaution to ensure that my beach house, my sanctuary, and a symbol of decades of hard work remained exactly where it belonged, with me. The property that Arav had assumed was his birthright was now safeguarded by legal means, binding and indisputable. There was a subtle satisfaction in knowing that he could no longer make demands, that his threats and schemes had been neutralized. But there was also something deeper, a sense of empowerment that came from taking control of my own life, from refusing to allow entitlement and greed to dictate my choices. I'd learned the hard way that love and blood ties could be exploited, but strength and prudence could not. The phone rang, breaking the stillness. It was Arav. The nerve. I let it ring for a few moments, listening to the tone of frustration I could almost hear through the line. Finally, I picked up. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, voice tight, strained. "About what, exactly?" I asked, calmly, letting the power in my voice underscore my point. You can't just... This isn't fair! Mom would have wanted... I smiled, a cold, controlled smile. Your mother would have wanted me to protect my home, my life, and my well-being, not to give in to entitlement disguised as family obligation. There was silence on the other end, and I could almost hear him fumbling for words. I continued, my tone deliberate, measured. You were invited into my home, raised with love, and given every opportunity to succeed. And yet, you chose manipulation and greed over gratitude. That choice has consequences, as you are now learning. He sputtered, anger mixing with disbelief. But the house, it's mine. No, Arav, it's mine, and I choose who it belongs to. Your demands do not override my rights, nor do they erase the years of guidance, support, and generosity I provided. I gave you everything except the right to dictate my life. The line went quiet again. Finally, he hung up, probably realizing that this battle was lost before it even began. I placed the phone down and walked toward the window, looking out at the sparkling waters of the ocean that stretched beyond my beach house. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore reminded me of something essential. Life goes on, and the tides of change always arrive whether you are ready or not. I thought back to the last conversation I had with Arav, the rage and disbelief in his eyes when he realized he had no control over my decisions. That look so full of entitlement and expectation was now replaced in my memory with clarity. I was finally free from the shadow of manipulation, free to live on my own terms. In the coming weeks, I hosted a small gathering of friends and neighbors, people who truly cared, who valued honesty and kindness over schemes and ambition. We laughed, shared stories, and celebrated the preservation of a home that had seen generations of joy, love, and memories. It was the first time in years I felt completely at peace. And then there was Arav. He never came around, never tried to reconcile, and in truth, I felt no need for him to. Sometimes the severing of ties is the only way to protect yourself. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living well, peacefully, and without fear of betrayal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The house was safe, my legacy intact, and my life finally my own. No son, no spouse,
No manipulator could take that from me. I settled into my favorite chair, a book in hand, the sound of the waves a soothing symphony. For the first time in decades, I felt the quiet, unshakable satisfaction of knowing that I had reclaimed my life, my autonomy, and my peace. The drama, the betrayal, and the greed had all faded into the background, leaving only the clarity of a life lived with intention, resilience, and above all, freedom. Sometimes I thought the best revenge isn't cruelty or punishment. It's simply living well and proving, without words, that no one can dictate your worth or your choices. And with that, I finally exhaled, letting the weight of past betrayals slip away with the tide.